This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
As I was saying, I've given you a handout which is rather meaty, and what it consists of is a few glosses of the novels I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I couldn't really, I had a bit of a problem cutting words out of this paper, so I've cheated. So this paper, it brings together two strands of my research on Francophone literature from Algeria. And the primary question the paper addresses is that the shifting centres of publication of Francophone Algerian literature between Paris and Algiers. By means of illustration, I'll look at the recent multiple uses of the figure of Albert Camus, who's up there, in three recent novels by three Algerian writers. And I'll use him as an example of how writers have not only looked within their own country since the end of the violent civil war in the 1990s, but have actively sought to layer their resistance to formal powers beyond the more visible state apparatus in Algeria, be that of the former colony or post-independence Algeria. The three novels in question, which you have in front of you, are first, let's look up here, Hamid Green's Un Parfum d'Absinthe, as it was published in 2010 in Algiers by Édition Alpha, and which was published in Paris in 2011 by Édition Après la Lune as Camus dans le Navire, which apparently also featured for a time in the Fnac's bestseller list. And this tells of an Algerian teacher's search for his father, who is alleged by a disgruntled uncle to be Albert Camus. Second, I'll look at Salim Bachir's Le Dernier Été d'un Jeune Homme, in which Camus' voice is reimagined in the first-person, semi-fictional biography of his early life. It's actually a biography written as autobiography in the first person. And third, I'll look at Kamal Daoud's recent Morceau contre enquête, which rewrites Camus' 1942 classic L'Étranger, taking on the fictional voice of the Arab, or the brother of the Arab who was killed on a beach by Camus' protagonist, Morceau. So I'll argue that a particular dominant Paris centre of publishing is targeted by a variety of means, expressed here primarily in the Camus myth, which has been kind of recently consecrated at Édition Gallimard, in particular reference to the myth consecrated by the celebrations around the kind of centenaire of Camus in France, for which Gallimard, of course, have re-released a lot of Camus' major works within nice kind of collections. I'll argue that in seeking to strike the French centre where it hurts most, we can ask whether such Francophone literature hasn't itself fallen into the trap of reinforcing a kind of centre-periphery stereotype, only creating in a new Algerian publishing a broad Mediterranean periphery, with Paris maintaining a kind of real pull for contemporary authors. Alternatively, we could ask to what extent have Algerian writers established Algiers as a new centre of publishing in its own right? And finally, we could ask, does Algiers offer a space of resistance not just from this centre of Paris, but the very idea of the kind of centre-periphery dialectic, the French, the Francophone, or indeed a kind of littérature monde, as the interpretive model for contemporary post-colonial literatures written in French. So that's quite a meaty introduction. So in recent work which examines the shifting borders of publishing in contemporary French language writing, Patrick Crowley offers a number of interpretive models with regard to a centre-periphery dialectic. He argues for a need to recognise the increasingly transnational nature of publishing in French. Writing in the context of the surge of French language publishing outside the borders of the former métropole, Crowley points specifically to North Africa as a site of interest. He cites Maurice Lemire and Pascal Casanova, who have argued that literature in French published outside France can be broadly defined along pacified conservative lines within the métropole, and combative nationalist lines outside. He also cites Theo de Haine, who equally underlines the hierarchical view, affirming that literatures in French published outside France could be seen to constitute a borrowing culture, which tends to reinforce the greatness of the initial culture by a, I quote, rewriting which consecrates the original. Crowley suggests that we test Casanova's model of combative literatures in the context of the Mediterranean, where nationalist cultures are likely to be particularly prevalent. In keeping with the polemical contre-enquête of Kamal Daoud's novel, we might ask whether his fiction can be reduced to a centre-periphery model in a broader sense of the Mediterranean periphery, where Casanova's combative literature comes to define his rewriting of the Camusian classic as a means of inventing a new, artificial yet competing myth of the Arab. Crowley concludes that while such binaries may on the surface fit with literatures being published in and out of France today, the reality is that those North African authors who have addressed themes of the nation and of the post-colonial have more often been published in France, where smaller publishers have been used to filter writers through to the larger markets. Indeed, Casanova cites Franco Moretti's so-called three-part division, introducing the space of the semi-periphery to mediate between the more distant periphery, say here in the Mediterranean, and the Parisian centre. Such a reading would reinforce the idea that whatever alternatives are offered to a kind of what has become seen as an ideologically questionable apparatus of francophonie, the power of the Parisian publisher dictates that what is considered to be the best, i.e. the most marketable literature in French will ultimately filter through and end up being published and marketed from Paris. While Bachy, so this is Bachy's work, the kind of Camus biography or biography. On the left, you've got as it was published by Flammarion, and then as it was published in Algeria by Alzac, new publishing house. So while Bachy and Klein's works, this is Klein, that's Bachy, while Bachy and Klein's works might be seen in many ways to fit into a more obvious Parisian centre periphery, where Bachy penetrates the French centre and Klein the semi-periphery, Daoud's novel is perhaps more interesting in the light of notions of combat, rewriting, or indeed writing back. The novel charts the aftermath of the killing of Camus' Arab, as well as the trial and publication of L'Étranger itself. In an almost direct inversion of Camus' narrative, it ends with the narrator, the Arab's brother, Haroun, not being found guilty for the murder of a French settler killed during the summer 1962. And like Meursault, Haroun wishes for his existence to be affirmed by the cri de haine at his execution. Grimm's novel is first published in Algiers, as we've said, at Éditions Alpha, a publisher which emerged in 2006, and is republished by the Parisian publisher Éditions Après la Lune. Itself is a kind of small, marginal publisher in Paris. While Bachy starts out by aiming for the Parisian centre, so he wanted his book, he submitted the manuscript to Éditions Gallimard initially, and he'd been published in the Collection Blanche by Gallimard before, and the novel was rejected. And Bachy said in an interview that it was actually Catherine Camus that Gallimard had consulted, and she had said that she did not like. She obviously controlled her father's literary estate, and she didn't like the fact that Bachy had made Camus, her father, a character in this novel. She didn't like the fact that it was kind of appropriated his voice in the way it does. And then the new Algerian publisher, Éditions Balzac, republishes Bachy's work in the same year, 2013. Daoud's novel hasn't been published in France yet, but it will be this year. It will be published by Actes Sud, who have a collaboration with Balzac in Algiers. So to look again at the content, it remains clear that some sort of combat is taking place between literatures published in and outside metropolitan France. Bachy's novel, a work in which the author attempts to understand the finer nuances of Camus' human character and early interactions, which later led to his paralysis on the question of Algerian independence, clearly situates Camus as a writer of Algerian origin, subverting both the Algerian nationalist opposition to his work and the French, as well as the French consecration of his posthumous myth. Perhaps more complexly figured in Green's novel as a possible father figure for the Algerian protagonist Nabil, who becomes the symbolic son betrayed by the nationalist father, Camus is again placed at the site of resistance to both the Algerian nationalist myth and that of Camus as a uniquely French writer. Camus' Algerian origins are traced through this quest for the father in Green's novel, which clearly encodes the symbolic search for the nation in the context of a new war which engulfed Algeria during the 1990s. For Daoud, rewriting Camus' famous L'Étranger allows him to playfully fuse the figures of Camus and Meursault, destroying the sanctity of the distinction between the author and his fictional creations. I cite le titre En était l'étranger, le nom de l'assassin était écrit en lettres noires et strictes au nom à droite, Albert Meursault. To see Daoud's novel as a combative piece of literature, which writes in singular opposition to Camus, and to recall De Haye as one which further consecrates the Camus myth at Édition Gallimard, would perhaps risk oversimplification and merely reinforce a centre British stereotype. The Algerian case today, one could argue, is far more complex, and to merely restate the binary, I think, would be to misread critiques of the nation implicit in each of these texts. In Green's text, the image of the nationalist father is in the mind, while Bashi writes Camus into Algerian national history, and Daoud seeks to question the hegemony of the Arab-oriented state. All of the three novels can be placed at the juncture of competing myths by Camus, the myth of Camus, and now the myth of the Arab. The text challenged both the dogma of Algerian nationalism and attempts to compartmentalise French language literatures produced outside of France within the reductive apparatus of francophonie or littérature monde in France, the debates around which I'm sure most of you are aware. While initially appearing as a challenge, a movement of resistance and redistribution of power in Francophone publishing today, the Algerian case is testimony, I think, to the power to move beyond the old binaries through which the post-colonial nation has been and is still so often viewed. The publishing industry seems to be at its strongest here in its fluidity, its capacity to continually adapt, and it is certainly young, but such is its youth, its vivacity, and of course its linguistic variation. Algerian publishing sits at a point of exchange. We must thus acknowledge the shifting power structures in publishing not only between France and Algeria, but look increasingly beyond Algeria's relationship with the former colonial power. As Crowley notes, new publishers in Algeria are not just forging commercial relationships with French or indeed Francophone publishers. While Édition Balzac, one of the larger publishers to emerge in Algiers, initially published only in French, they have since published a range of Arabic titles and translations thereof, and is thus part of a publishing sector which continues to grow in and beyond Algeria. Links have been established between Algiers and Lebanon, for example. What's more, Algerian writers have elected to write in French. For many, French is not a language they speak every day. The language is thus being used by authors who are bi or trilingual. One of Algeria's principal new publishers, as I mentioned, which emerged in 2000 after the end of the Algerian civil conflict in the 1990s, Édition Balzac, now has over 120 works on its catalogue and publishes Bashi's novel in Algiers and Daoud's novel here. The publisher takes its name from the symbolic space of the Balzac, which in Sufi theology relates not only to a space of purgatory, a space between life and death, but that of the isthma, the isthmus, defined as a piece of narrow land which connects two separate land masses. This Balzac can be related to a post-colonial interconnectedness, a kind of purging of past woes by sharing literary spaces of publication, Within the Balzac, literature itself can be the isthmus linking post-colonial France and Algeria, while also representing a transition from the specific narratives of colonial violence and more recent state and fundamentalist violence to those of a universal and global nature. Before the publication of his Camus autobiography, Salim Bashi authored two perhaps more controversial novels which take and refigure the terrorist in the run-up to the 1995 Paris metro bombings and to 9/11. Fundamentally, these novels can be said to sit at a point of exchange between Algeria and the rest of the world, interrogating our perspectives on terror by building them into a multi-layered history from the specific in the Algerian War of Independence to Algeria's civil war of the 1990s to the universal, interrogating the so-called global terror. Such literatures, while on the one hand openly invoking the author's name, seem to do so in order to leave Camus behind, or at least the dominant myths of his legacy, which permeate French and Francophone literature. In conclusion, between the specific and the universal, there is a narrow bridge of land, of Balzac, which is a space, albeit small, for literature to live and grow, to pool its power, and to build resistance, to speak truth to power. This bridge is horizontal. The novels studied above alternate between the binary positions of centre, semi-periphery, and periphery, but they also carve out a new space, which at least momentarily allows them to exist outside of these fixed, competitive, and vertical hierarchies of power, where neither the singular francophonie nor littérature monde seem appropriate. These terms appear, as Zineb Ben Ali has recently suggested, comme un vêtement mal ajusté. Yet, as others have more recently suggested, it's perhaps the term francophone we need to retain in such contexts, in countering the ideologically compromised francophonie and perhaps overly vague, what's called overly vague littérature monde. In re-embracing the francophone, Leah Brosgal recently suggests that we might do well to come to terms with the dissatisfaction of this term, but to nonetheless stress its importance in leaving a historical trace of colonialism. Some have suggested using the term francophonie liquide, after the sociologist Sigmund Bauman's liquid modernity. Perhaps we might also suggest something which is less linguistically determined, like littérature liquide or liquid literature, something like that. As a publisher of the Balzac, then, as a representative of other new emerging publishers in Algiers, is also an isthmus from writer to reader, from thought to action, from words to speech. And in the Balzac is Camus, whose posthumous figure provides not just the link back to the former métropole, nor merely a simple attack on the overpowering Parisian centre, but a poetics of exchange, allowing for the possibility of new centres from the invidious realities of old conflicts to increasingly perhaps liquid futures of peace. As Françoise Lyonnais, paraphrasing Bauman, has put it, true universality is the actual ability to translate differences into an acknowledgement of diversity. The unending process of translation as exchange in itself constitutes a challenge, both linguistic and cultural, to the dominant Parisian centre. In this sense, a new francophone Algerian literature recalls Abdelkabir Khatibi's words when he writes that toute cette littérature dite d'expression française est un récit de traduction. This constitutes a return to Khatibian pensée plurielle, where the collective pronoun nous refers not to an us and them binary, but to a human nous, which transcends a narrative of competition, sitting at the interstices between two or more languages and cultures. It may well be the posthumous figure of Camus, who's sitting up there from a recent article published in El Watan, a major Algerian newspaper, it may well be the posthumous figure of Albert Camus, who still most effectively encapsulates this transcendence. Thank you.